No intro necessary. You guys know why you clicked on this video. Let's get right into it. Why do these things crash? So let's go through a couple obvious reasons, a couple not so obvious reasons, and then it's really going to depend on your situation. So if your drone kind of seemingly fell out of the sky, I gotta say, that's what I thought happened to this one. And if you guys want to stick around to the end, I'll give you the story on what actually happened, or I guess my very best guess, because I don't think I'm ever really gonna know. It's down to two options, but stick around. Anyway, reason number one, and one near and dear to my heart: damaged propellers. Oops, I just kind of clipped this one a little bit. So, I know it's annoying. Every time that you guys want to fly, you want to do a quick little visual check of each one of these propeller blades. Also, pro tip, open them up before you take off, just because the rattle that happens when they are closed like this, it's not good for the drone over the long run, especially not the gimbal. So just do your drone a favor, just give them a nice little spread like that. But yeah, do some visual checks. I would say first check the blades themselves, make sure there's no obvious cracks, scratches. Scratches are fine, cracks not so much. And then really not an obvious one, you want to kind of get right into the attachment of the blade, because if that's cracked, there's so much centrifugal force spinning these blades outward, obviously, that if there's a crack or any sort of fault within the connection to the base of the drone, that's going to be a huge problem. So cracks you can sometimes get away with. I've seen people cut even half the propeller blade off entirely and then do a flight test, and the drone still will fly. So the propeller on the outside being cracked, yeah, I wouldn't fly a drone if I saw it like that. But really what you want to get in there and check for every time is the connection to the actual arm of the drone. Number two, batteries. Batteries could be a number of issues. And then as you guys can see here, I have a ton, because they can go bad pretty much at any time. DJI has a really good warranty on their batteries. They have, they're pretty protective of their products in general. So just reach out to them if you ever do get like a faulty battery, if it starts swelling. But big thing to keep in mind is the battery temperature for LiPo batteries is really important. So you want to keep them around room temperature. You really don't want to start up a drone and have the battery be almost freezing. A lot of times the drone won't take off, it will stop you. And then on the other end as well, you want to avoid charging batteries when they're hot off the drone, and you want to avoid just using a hot battery in general. Obviously the battery's going to build up some heat while it's in use, and that's fine, that's to be expected. But just kind of let the batteries return to a baseline, because the treatment of these batteries really will determine the lifespan that you get out of them. If you're always leaving it in a hot car, or you're always charging it right after you go out for a flight, again, the DJI batteries, they're pretty smart, so they will stop you a lot of times. If you're charging a battery right after you've just flown it, it's still too hot, it won't charge. But don't try to force it, because there will be a point where it's still cooling down, but the charger kind of will give you the go-ahead. Just play it safe, let it return to room temperature. So cold and heat, you want to operate in like this middle ground. So if your drone fell out of the sky, could have been a battery issue. So big thing you can do, there's this website called AirData. I used that when my drone fell out of the sky just to get some more information. In my case, it didn't really have exactly what I need, because it was more of an exterior issue. I'll get into it at the end. But yeah, go to AirData. They will have every single little piece of information that you could possibly want about your drone during its flight. You can see your stick position, you can see how fast you're going, the wind gusts, you can see the weather. Anything that you think would affect the drone, it's going to be on there. So check that out. If anything ever goes wrong, you're going to get a really good idea of the issues that may have come up, or any warnings that may have come up that maybe you didn't see, or maybe that weren't even displayed. They were just kind of interior issues in the drone. So batteries are a big one, because if they do swell, sometimes, like I'll show you, the Air 2S actually kind of does have this problem, I've heard, where sometimes if the battery swells up enough, it will push it right out of there. And I'm sure you guys can figure out that a battery being forced out of the aircraft mid-flight, it's not going to turn out too well. I don't think that return to home is going to save you at that point. Number three, this one is apparently fairly rare, but it's definitely a phobia of mine. Hitting a bird. So sometimes when you're up there, obviously you're looking at your screen. I know we don't all stay within line of sight, but you're also not looking at the drone the whole time while you're flying it. That kind of defeats the whole purpose. A lot of times in these situations where someone does hit a bird, you can't even see the bird. Even if you're reviewing the footage, they could have hit it from the side, they could have hit it from the back, they could have come straight down on top of it. So be very aware when you're around a very highly populated bird area, so like the beaches, around nests as well. So you want to be really careful around nests. You're not always going to know when they're there, but those parental birds, they will let you know. That's really the only time I've heard of birds actively attacking drones is when they are protecting their nest. Otherwise, they'll kind of stay away from you. Otherwise, if you find yourself surrounded by birds and you can visually see this before any of them actually make contact with it, the best way to get away from them is to just go straight up. Birds can't fly straight up. They kind of need to almost act as if there's an imaginary ramp. So just go straight up. They'll leave you alone most of the times, but if you do have issues in your area with birds persistently attacking your drone, there's a couple videos out there showing you different types of reflective tapes and things you can do to mitigate it. But again, I've personally never hit a bird, I think, but definitely something I'm kind of afraid of. So if I see birds in the area, I'll keep it really close and as far away from the birds as possible. Number 4. This one kind of sneaks up on people and could cause some issues. DJI in particular, they don't really let you go too far or too high without your GPS attaching first. So make sure when you're taking off, let everything kind of sit for a second. I would bring up the drone to about 6-7 feet, let it hover, maybe go a little side to side. Just make sure the drone's acting normally, listen, get an idea for what the drone is supposed to sound like, what it normally sounds like. But yeah, one of the biggest things, just make sure it grabs enough of the satellites before you actually kind of go out and about. If for some reason you're able to go take off and start flying 50, 60, 300 feet up in the air and you don't have those satellites, if something goes wrong, that drone is not going to establish a home point if it can't grab enough satellites. So give it a second. If you are in an area with a lot of tree cover, a lot of building cover, consider moving and then taking off from somewhere else. When I'm starting up my controller and my drone, I start the drone first because sometimes it takes a second to grab all those satellite connections. So the drone's not going to fly away if you start that first without the controller. Maybe on older ones that were picking up like Wi-Fi signals, Bluetooth signals, they're really good now with pairing to the remote and your remote alone. But give it a second to start grabbing those GPSs because while you're setting up the remote, connecting it to your phone, your drone's already doing the work of making sure that it's starting to piece together where all these satellites are. So if you ever had an issue where your controller died and the drone never came back, that could have been the reason. Number 5, another thing to keep in mind is weather. And that sounds obvious at first, but what isn't obvious to everybody, the higher you go, almost always the windier it's going to be. So if it's pretty gusty at ground level, you can be pretty confident that when you go up to about 50, 60, 70 feet, those winds are really starting to pick up. So 15 mile an hour winds on the ground might not seem too much, especially for these drones that do have really good GPS coordination at this point. They can keep themselves in the same spot no matter what the wind conditions are like, up to a point. A lot of these DJI drones, and I'm sure Autel and I'm sure other brands as well, they can withstand gusts up to about 30 miles an hour. But once you get up higher in altitude, all bets are off the table. Like, you don't really know how gusty that wind is going to be. That's another reason to check out Air Data. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. They're just a really good website for just finding out anything you need to know about weather, finding out like what times are good to fly. So their mobile app's actually really good. It will give you an hour by hour breakdown on if it's good to fly or if there's something you should keep in mind, whether it's gusty, whether I'm blanking. There's other things too that they'll also consider. But keep in mind wind when you go higher. So if you suddenly lost control of your drone when it got to about 80, 90, 100 feet in the air, it very well could have been wind. And I had that issue a ton on my Mavic 1. Really, every single time I flew the drone, it would tell me, like, be careful, you're flying in super windy conditions. So I really started ignoring it. I don't think it really ever caused me any problems, but again, if that's what happened to you, that there's a very good chance that a strong wind gust did take it away. Now, the Air 2S, I haven't had that problem at all. Like, the Air 2S has been fantastic. I haven't gotten the high wind notification at all. I'm starting to think they took it off the actual DJI app because that's how much I have not seen it. Number 6, obstacle avoidance. Now, you never want to rely on obstacle avoidance for obvious reasons. It's going to fail you sometimes, especially when you get near trees where they have those kind of twiggy branches with not many leaves on them. Trees are like a drone's worst nightmare. And then objects that kind of pass in front of it quickly, whether it's a car, your drone's not going to be able to get out of the way of a car. So keep in mind your drone's limitation on what direction it can do obstacle avoidance. So for example, Mavic 1, really basic in its obstacle avoidance. It had them up here, right in the front of the drone, and then right at the bottom of the drone. So you weren't crashing into anything right in front, or you weren't going to descend on anything. Now, big upgrade since the Mavic 1, the Air 2S has them in pretty much every direction except arguably one of the most important does not have it on the sides. So I've gotten myself into a couple situations already where I've gotten a little too close to things, and all of a sudden when I'm doing one of those panning shots, I see branches in the foreground that I did not think were going to be that close, and then I look up, my drone's floating maybe 2 feet away from a tree. So keep in mind, don't rely on the obstacle avoidance. And also, if you want to rely on it a little bit, make sure it's on, because a lot of times I'll turn it off. Like for example, I take off right from my backyard. The patio I have is really small, so for me to back the drone up close to the glass door that's out there, I have to turn the obstacle avoidance off, otherwise the drone's going to fight me. And the alternative is landing on a bunch of sand, and I don't want to do that. So I turn it off. I believe when you turn the drone back on, the settings will reset, your obstacle avoidance will be on, but just do that as a double check. So if you felt like your drone just crashed into a tree or crashed into a building for no reason, you might want to check if your obstacle avoidance was on. And I don't know if you could find that in airdata.com, but just check it out anyway. All right, so those are all my tips and reasons as to why your drone may have crashed. I'm sure there's more. Definitely let me know in the comments if something else has happened to you. That should cover like 90% of crashes pretty much. Because like I said, the drones are pretty smart. They are going to avoid crashing almost all the time. Usually it's going to be pilot error. So I will tell you guys my story on how my first child met its demise into the ocean. So I had brought it up to visit my mom, and I was flying it around a ton that week just for practice because I knew my Air 2S was coming and I wanted to be just like super sharp, just make sure I had kind of all the maneuvers down, make any stupid mistakes with the old one before the Air 2S. So I brought it to the beach and I was getting a lot of really good shots, but what I had noticed was over the last week or so, I couldn't fly the drone in a straight line. Like I would try to go straight, that would be the only direction I'm pressing on the joystick, and it would always find a way to drift off in one direction. And I kind of attribute it to the drone being about 7 years old at this point, so I really just passed it off. I think that may have been a warning sign, so definitely keep that in mind too. When you're flying your drone, if anything feels weird, if it sounds weird, if it's drifting, don't just chalk it up as like a technological glitch or anything that should just be dismissed. Do a thorough investigation throughout your drone. I learned this the hard way. I brought it to the beach and I'm getting this really cool shot flying directly above like the waves crashing. I was probably about 60 feet up in the air, so it was offering like a good perspective. Out of nowhere, the drone looks like it's just randomly spinning out of the sky. And I figured it was a gimbal malfunction because it had actually been doing that a couple times over the last couple of weeks too, where I'd be looking at the camera and the gimbal would just all of a sudden float up and be sideways and kind of just like slowly floating down. So from my perspective, it looked like the drone was in free fall, and it gave me several heart attacks over the couple weeks prior to the actual incident. So at first when I'm flying over the ocean and I just see the camera essentially just spinning out of control, I didn't immediately panic. I didn't feel good about it, but I was like, oh, it's probably just the gimbal. I would say it did it for about a second and a half, and then the transmission just went black. And at that point, I knew something really bad had happened. As it was spinning, just as like a precaution, because I still thought it was the gimbal, I slammed left on the joystick to get it just away from the ocean, thinking, just in case this is falling, maybe I can salvage it. I think that may have not saved it, because the drone was completely ruined, but it saved it from me being in the ocean to in the line where the waves break. I kind of spoiled the end of the story, but what happened, it did start just spinning randomly out of the sky. It fell about 60 feet right into the waves, and by the time I got over there, I was only about 300, 400 feet away, and it had probably been getting pummeled by waves for about a minute before I was able to track it down. And some woman was actually walking up to it, and she thought it was a crab apparently, but it was my drone trying not to cry. That was pretty traumatic. So after some investigation, first of all, I was pissed. I was confused, because from my perspective, what could have happened? I'm flying over the ocean. There's nothing around. There weren't even that many birds around, if at all. I would have to assume there's some birds because I was at the beach, but I didn't see any, so I didn't assume that I hit a bird. But I find the drone, and on like the back left propeller, all the other propellers are fine. The back left, one of them is in half, and then one of them is completely missing. I didn't think much of it at the time because I just kind of assumed that, I don't know, it just fell 60 feet out of the sky. I'm sure the propeller just fell off somehow. And then I went out to watch some videos, and people were really trying to break these propellers with their bare hands, and they couldn't do it. So, again, I don't know exactly what happened, but my best guess, and I think it's a reasonable guess, that's why I started with the propeller tip. I think right in here, if this is going to focus, yeah, right in here, I think there was a crack. And when I did my little visual inspections on the propellers, and they weren't thorough, I could have been better. I didn't look for that. I looked for the cracks along the blades, but I think one of those propellers just flew off mid-flight, because I was going about 35 miles an hour. I was kind of pushing it in sport mode. So I think the pressure on the propeller, I think that also explains why it started drifting when I was just over like level ground. But that's my story. Lost propeller. So definitely take the propeller inspection serious. I know it's annoying. I know you guys go up for a lot of flights. It's worth it. It takes maybe 10 seconds. And trust me, those 10 seconds, I know it's every time, but it's worth the $1,000, $1,500 that it's going to take to replace your drone. So that's it for me. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys got some entertainment out of my sad story of losing my Mavic. But it's all good now because I have a new baby, and she's doing great so far. So that's it. Hope you guys liked it.